Hello and welcome to our lecture, our kind of final lecture on Jeffrey Kripal today. This lecture is called Reflexive Rereadings, Kripal's Game. So we're really getting to the end here, and Kripal is going to pull out all his stops and kind of tell you where he's been going all along, kind of reveal his hand. In reality, it won't be very surprising, the conclusions he comes up with, and you'll hear some of my critiques as we go. But let's get into it. So Kripal argues that when you're interpreting religion, or you're interpreting anything for that matter, you have to figure out what is on the table and what is off the table. And the way you interpret will depend on what is on the table or off the table. We know this metaphor when we say, oh, this option is off the table or everything is on the table. The idea is, this is your data set. What are you going to put in your data set for trying to understand religion? Most religious studies puts history, scripture, and theology of the big five religions on the table. But it leaves off miracles, individual experiences, anomalous rituals, magic, the paranormal, aliens, trauma. All that's thrown off the table when they decide what they're going to look at when they look at religion. Well, Kripal wants to expand that table, adding all sorts of other stuff, especially weird stuff. And I agree. I really agree with him on this, that religion suffuses all cultures, so we need a really big table to kind of understand it. Now, Kripal wants more than to just expand the table. He wants more in general. He paraphrases Robert Orsi, who's a very important scholar of sort of lived Catholic experience, to argue for a school of more. Robert Orsi argues for a tradition of more. Kripal talks about the school of more. I would also say that he kind of does this school of the weird. So as we start looking at religion, and as we've done in this class, we wonder how big is the table? What goes on the table? What goes off the table? So what data do you select when you're trying to make an argument about what is religion and how religion operates? Well, first off, I think really it's key that we need to acknowledge the paranormal. Kripal rightly argues that dismissing and denying the paranormal is lazy. We have reports of the paranormal that are so widespread and well documented that we have to study them. And what are these paranormal things? But these are phenomena where mere material explanations fail. We can't just make an argument about this did this, which caused this. So we have such problems as Charles Fort referred to them as damned things, where they're just too odd to deny and no way to figure them out. Or synchronicities, when you have a seemingly odd event that happens to a person, but has sort of a greater meaning. Like when I pick up the phone to call a friend and they're calling me at the same time. That's sort of a simple synchronicity. So we also saw from Dean Radin that there's a sort of science of magic, and by which, when he's talking about magic and studying magic via science, he's talking about the mind influencing the material world. And he says that the experiments show that it is a statistically significant observation that mental focus can alter somehow the external world. So in this, we are sort of stuck between belief and reason. Yet history and our data for religion overflow both understandings of belief and reasoning. So we can't really settle anything by a faithful rereading, as we had in one chapter, or a rational rereading. In fact, Kripal argues for a reflexive rereading. The reflexive rereading thoroughly understands the faithful, then looks and makes a rational argument and sort of looks at all the rational reasons for religion to exist and how it operates, and then posits that there's something more that is behind the rational reason that's influencing the world that we can't put our fingers on. So Kripal makes this argument that when he's asked by people, why should you study in this way, he says, why not? Why not study the weird stuff? How can we really argue that the weird stuff is not religious, or is the building block of religion? Because religion is so weird. It's about magic powers, people coming back from the dead. That's what religion is all about. So I think we're actually well served by getting involved with high weirdness. I always like this term, high weirdness. High weirdness is sort of like a concept in sort of pulp culture of really, really strange stuff with religious implications. So High weirdness is a moment where things start getting complicated and things start getting interesting. When stuff gets odd, when you can't quite figure out what's going on, that's when you're onto something. That's like when you really sort of look at Protestant Christians who say that, you know, the core of their religion is their connection to Christ who rules their life. I'm like, well, what's with all these angels? And then they get real cagey. So look to weird stuff. And that's when you'll find understandings of religion and phenomenon that go beyond just what people say. Toward this notion of studying weird things, Kripal gives the metaphor of his father, who was a mechanic. And his mechanic father said the best way to understand something and fix something is to take it apart very carefully and find where things are behaving in an unexpected manner. So you start taking the engine apart and looking for where there's a misfire, or looking for where something doesn't connect right, or look to what item as you pull items away is actually failing. This is a good way to think about religion. One other way to think about it is the weird is like a glitch in the Matrix, if you've seen the movie The Matrix. So reality just doesn't add up and something odd happens. These glitches, these kind of odd anomalous moments, are where religion develops. This is how Ann Taves argues that these glitches and these weird things, this high weirdness, are in fact singular experiences that are deemed religious by those people who experience them, that become the very building blocks of religion, that cause adaptation in religion, that found religions. So getting right back to Jeffrey Kripal's vocabulary, we have reflexive rereadings, which is the title of our chapter for today. But what does he mean by rereading? Well, interpretation is not just reading, but it's rereading. And when you think about rereading, I want you to think interpretation. Code that as interpretation. Religion is often multiple, and religious interpretation is often multiple. And what I mean by multiple is that one carefully rereads religious texts and revelation over and over and over again. Generally, religion doesn't manifest in a way or get thought of in a way that you just read something once that makes sense. Reading, in fact, is interpretation, always. The first reading of a religious thing is to read it as it is and to read revelation as it's recorded. But rereadings going back to interpret and rethink religious explanations. Most of our general thinking is about rereading contents. When you think about how you think, you can notice that you're often revisiting the same topics, and you're often rereading the same ideas over and over again until something changes. So we have faithful rereadings, as we do a little review. Faithful rereadings are readings that come from the standpoint of believing, of asserting the truth of religion and revelation, of saying they're true. However, that truth might be interpreted and adapted to fit appropriate social situations, including political resistance. We saw like queer theology, Black theology, and whatnot as faithful rereadings. Now, there's also rational rereadings. This is reductionism, what we called it. Religion is about something else other than revelation. Religion is about something other than revelation. Religion is not truth, but it's actually about something else. So we would argue that religion can be explained and reduced to a natural process, be that social, psychological, biological, or evolutionary. The test for this is when someone says, religion is merely X, religion is merely wish fulfillment, religion is merely social institutions reflected in a person, and the like. Now, reflexive rereadings is where Kripal wants to make his big intervention. He says that the faithful and the rational have to be thoroughly thought through, and then a reflexive rereading goes beyond both the faithful and the rational. As he says, comparison and analysis of religions that rationality reduces religious phenomenon. Comparison and analysis of religions that rationality reduces religious phenomenon to human nature, only to discover that this nature overflows the reach of the original rationalist models. The model would be, I would say, religion is just wish fulfillment. So then I think that through all the way, and then I would say, where do those wishes come from? I would posit that those wishes come from mind or consciousness. Where is mind or consciousness? But it's something greater than just the individual. So after rationally interpreting faithful arguments, so you're rationally interpreting these faithful readings of religion and the contents of revelation, a reflexive rereader actually then posits that there's something more. that something is coming through that social process, that the human culture creating religion is something more than human, that the human is too. Kripal says this is the more test. A reflexive rereading is always finding there's something more than what you're looking at. So after a series of, and this is his, I think he gives a good summary here. After a series of reductive or rationalist rereadings, is there some intuitive truth or anomalous event, some altered state of energy or knowledge that is not finally explicable in rationalist or materialist terms? In short, is there something more? Note that this more need not be determined or defined, since no faith tradition or set of doctrines is privileged or required, which is why these reflexive rereadings are not faithful rereadings. All that is required to label a rereading reflexive is for such a more to be posited as likely or possible. So what you do is, as you think through the rationalist thing, sort of religion is social structure, you would think through to the rational conclusion that you would see that religion is rooted in social institutions or totems or something like that. Then you would say, well, where do these come from originally? Where do the totems come from? And you would say, so society is made up of individuals that gradually had these ideas and they got put into us and into our culture, and that's what creates the sociology of religion. But then it would go further and say, maybe something is speaking through those individuals that first posited that totem. And what is that? Now, reflexive rereadings explicitly say it's not God, as you would think of in Christianity or Hinduism or whatever. It's something more, and that something more is necessarily vague. All right, so what is Kripal working with that you have an idea called a dialectic? You'll hear about this in philosophy quite a bit. Now, these three modes are dialectical in the sense that they talk to one another in order to posit something else. A dialectic involves finding contradictions and showing how, working with them back and forth, you can establish a truth that encompasses all of them. You have your thesis, then you have the antithesis, and they fight together until you come to something that incorporates both of them or takes it in a new direction. So much of Kripal's argument is dialectical, and his comparisons are dialectical, and that you have an A and you have a B, and then you have a C that unites them. So this idea of dialectics is quite useful in thinking about what Kripal is doing here. So Kripal argues that nothing can be really settled just using faithful and rational rereadings, but I wonder, is anything really settled by these reflexive rereadings? I would say no. I mean, if you're trying to settle something or have an argument, a rational rereading is a pretty good one. A faithful reading it's an all right one. But at the end of the day, what are these reflexive rereadings saying? He's saying we should be open to something more. Well, I'm not comfortable stopping there with, oh, there's something more to this. I just don't think a lot is resolved here. I mean, it opens up interesting questions and helps us think about religion, but I don't think anything is really resolved. We're left in an even more uncertain place than we even started. But uncertainty is not a bad result of inquiry, especially when we're talking about religion and consciousness. The reflexive rereading argues that there is something more, but that something more cannot be really grasped. It does not attempt to turn that something more into something along the lines of religious dogma. So it's not going to say there is something more, and that something more is Yahweh the creator God, or Brahma the creator God. So these reflexive rereadings do not posit usual faithful, dogmatic, or theological understandings, but posit that there's something even further beyond that can't be grasped by these prior ideas. So let's look at some of these reflexive rereadings. I want to tell you about this guy, Jan Culiano, and he writes about an idea called the fourth dimension that we'll get to in just a second. It's really interesting stuff. But I want to tell you about Culiano. So Culiano was one of the most interesting and innovative historians of religion in the 20th century. He wrote this book called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, which is a classic study that really complicates our understanding of both Eros and the erotic and magic, especially high magic. Not the low magic that I study, but the high magic of transforming oneself into a god and ordering the universe. So he was a professor at the University of Chicago, and he was also an occultist. So his journals that we have preserved, because he died quite young, are filled with speculation on the history of religion, and then right next to that will be descriptions and interpretations of the tarot cards he pulled just that day for any specific reason. As a scholar and practitioner, he remained always a very, very good scholar who was open to interpretations that arise from practice. So he remained a scholar, but he would bring in insights from actual religious practice quite a lot. He was also a novelist who wrote like 6 or 7 different novels in Romanian. Now, he has a tragic end. He was actually murdered in the bathroom of the University of Chicago Divinity School. I've been there. I've stood and took a leak where he was taking a leak when he was shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol, we think. His murder was never solved. Now, in his own home country of Romania, he had been a critic of national politics, and in particular, a critic of the nationalist political right. He was 41 when he died. And we are wiser for everything he wrote. I can't imagine what we'd have as far as scholarly output and how much smarter we would all be if he had lived. So Culiano looks at religions around the world, and he notices that there are repeating themes. Similarities are found throughout religious cultures that suggest a simple set of rules, he says, that would generate similar results in the minds of human beings for a virtually infinite period of time. What are these sort of rules? There is another world. Okay, well, what do you think about that? There is a soul that separates from the body when a person dies. Now, heaven is up. So we see all these commonalities about these sort of ideas. And he says, well, where do these ideas come from? And he posits that maybe there is something grander that is working through these ideas. There is a human sameness. All human religion and culture arises from these analogous premises. And while there are differences, there are a lot of overlaps. And I do find this intriguing as you look across religions. Why do we see similarities? Why, when Kripal does all the comparisons at the end of every chapter in the first like 8 chapters of the book, why do we see such similar themes? Is it just because we are all humans and our brains all work the same way, or is there something more to it? I mean, I think Culiano would argue, and I think, that there's a similarity because all humans are the same creatures. But the question of who makes up these rules, and did these rules come from somewhere outside of us, is an intriguing one. I'm of the mind that no, they didn't come from outside of us. This is just, we're humans. This is how we understand the world. So the paranormal can be explained by the momentary experience of the 4th dimension. Now, what do I mean by 4th dimension? So what happens here is Culiano imagines that if you lived in a 2D world, like you were on a chessboard, in fact, you would only see forward and backward on a flat plane. The 3D person, a human like us, can pick a thing up. You can pick that chess piece up. You can look at it. You can turn it upside down. You can, put it anywhere on the board. You can do anything you want with it. But a 2D person experiencing that would not even be able to think about that 3D person. All they would witness is things teleporting and going left and right. They would experience being picked up into a whole other sphere and turned all over the place. So try to think about what a 2D chess piece would feel like if it lived in a 2D world and was suddenly pulled into a 3D world. Well, what about a 4D person? And a dimension beyond us, outside space and time as we know it. Just like we can move around the 2D person, manipulate the 2D person, making them appear and disappear, teleport or flip them around in the 3rd dimension, maybe they can do that to us. This is what the 4th dimension people would see looking at us 3D folks. It's also an interesting argument for the aliens and how aliens do what they do when they encounter us. The 3D dimension is us, and the 4D dimension is beyond us. So that's his idea of the 4th dimension. And he says that paranormal events are intrusions or witnessings of that 4th dimension, like the mystical experience of going into that 4th dimension, that timeless place beyond space and time, and also possibly the 4th dimension messing with us. One thing I really like that Kripal argues, not in this text but elsewhere, is that the paranormal is messing with us. That's the thing. Why can't we figure out? Because it's a force beyond us that's screwing with us. Why can't we figure out how the aliens operate and whatnot? Because they're messing with us. They're doing stuff that'll throw us off. To what end? Who knows? Maybe God's just messing with us. So what I want you to understand about this rereading of miracles and the paranormal as an intrusion into the 4th dimension is it has no connection to belief, to deities, to religious identity. There's nothing supernatural about this explanation of the paranormal. It's just math in a speculative world. That's why it's a reflexive rereading, not a faithful rereading. All right, the filter thesis. So in the filter thesis, the mind and brain is a filter. That physical mind brain is a filter that limits the amount of consciousness we experience. Consciousness is vast, and our mind-brain individuality throttles it down so that we might fulfill our biological imperatives. Because if we just were experiencing full mind all the time, we'd never get any darn thing done. Consciousness, in fact, is beyond the social identity, beyond cognition, beyond culture, and beyond ego. So we're positing that there is a mind at large, that I'll talk about in a second, but there's this vast consciousness. We experience it, but it's as if our brain restricts the amount of flow, so we only experience a small part of it. Now, this idea is kind of an old one. So we have the Meyers-James brain or mind as filter thesis. So William James was the guy that wrote The Variety of Religious Experiences, and he is sort of the father of the psychology of religion, argued that there is a door to this greater consciousness, and that door is in our subconsciousness. And in our subconsciousness, we are connected to a wider and expansive ocean of consciousness. So grand consciousness everywhere. Then we have our subconscious that is linked to that. And then we have our conscious mind that is above that. And through our subconscious and having realizations that are subconscious, images coming forward into our conscious mind, that is the link to this greater, wider, expansive consciousness. Now, James was borrowing from his pal, Frederick Myers. Now, Myers posited an expansive version of the self that is more than the individual and more than the ego. This is what's called the subliminal self, and we don't have access to it. It's there with us all the time, but we don't have access to it. Now, subliminal means sub or below, and limen, which means threshold. So the consciousness that is below the threshold of our awareness. He even would capitalize the self when he writes subliminal self to show its great reach and cosmic implications. Now, this clearly overlaps with Freud. Freud has an idea that the unconscious, Freud never used the term subconscious. So if people talk about a Freudian subconscious, they don't know what they're talking about. Freud only talks about the unconscious. Subconscious isn't in there. Freud has an idea of the unconscious being this vast thing that is all of your memories and all of your repressed desires. And every time you've got a conflict in life, you need to block something out, you put it in your unconscious, and it occasionally erupts forth in dreams or a Freudian slip. So you say the wrong thing at the wrong time and it reveals something. So Freud also had a notion of a vast oceanic feeling. He describes the feeling of the child before it differentiates from its mother as being completely enveloped in a floating sea of awareness in which all of its needs are constantly being met without any separation between that which is meeting its needs. Freud says that all of these ideas are the root of religion. These characters take a little bit further. So hold on, I'm not quite ready for Aldous Huxley yet. So this subliminal self, according to Myers, is in fact the source and the performer of clairvoyance and telepathy. So this vast subconsciousness that we don't have easy access to, that's where telepathy, that's where the paranormal come from, that's where mental powers are. The mind is thought to be porous, according to these two guys with the filter theory. And that porousness is good. Through the subconscious, one can channel genius and creativity that comes from outside of the self. Now, there is also an idea of cosmic consciousness, similar to Jung's collective unconsciousness, but we're going to talk about this a little bit differently. So we individuate ourselves out of this cosmic consciousness, which is the pure root of all our consciousness. And we come to be individuals, but we're still connected by our connection to this cosmic consciousness that is everywhere and theoretically everything. This is like a metaphysical notion of Jung's collective unconscious. Jung's collective unconscious says that we not only have our own unconscious mind, but we have a collective unconscious mind. So that's where things like archetypes come from. If you've heard of archetypes, archetypes are like the symbols that appear in multiple cultures, like the hero or the trickster. So sort of archetypes are primordial symbols. And Jung would say that these come out of our collective unconscious. Well, this cosmic consciousness is positing something very metaphysical and saying that there is a consciousness that we are all a part of, that we have originated out of, and theoretically we will return to. There's a cosmic consciousness that might as well also be like sort of a panpsychism, or a, yeah, like as if there is a universal soul that is everywhere. All right, Aldous Huxley. So Aldous Huxley has a notion of the mind at large. Now, Huxley is from a famous family of writers. He's the grandson of a very famous writer, Aldous Huxley. What is his name? Thomas Huxley. And Aldous Huxley's best known works is Brave New World, which you may have read in high school or otherwise, and also a little book called The Doors of Perception. Now, this comes from a William Blake line that says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see reality as it really is. Now, the Doors of Perception is also where you get the name of the rock and roll band, The Doors. Jim Morrison, to no surprise, read a lot of Aldous Huxley and took a lot of drugs. So anyway, The Doors of Perception, the specific book, is a classic work in psychedelic literature. In this, Aldous Huxley grapples to understand his experiences when he took mescaline. Let's remember that at this time, hallucinogens and psychedelics were not illegal when he was writing about this. So he's not grappling with morality in any way. Huxley connects his psychedelic experiences to mystical experiences throughout time. He grapples with how a substance can create a mystical experience. Does that mean that mysticism is just brain chemistry? And how do we grapple with the fact that anyone without any religious training or predilection toward religion can now have a mystical experience, or a mystical experience, or an experience deemed mystical by taking a drug? Now, intriguingly, as you read through the book, and I recommend it, it's an intriguing little text, he never really describes hallucinations. He doesn't hallucinate when he's on this drug. He describes seeing and experiencing the objective world as the objective world as a whole, all at once, and seeing it more clearly than he has before. He has seen the suchness of reality. He's almost seeing reality as even more than real. In this, he sees the world, he says, without the limitations of brain filters. Again, the filter theory. Brain filters include identity, rationality, and ego. This mind at large he experiences, and the suchness of the world, he identifies as being the same as the experience of Brahman in Hinduism, this wider, incredible, full-on being of which you are identical with, or of Buddha nature, the fact that you can find the very nature of the Buddha in all things, all people, and even within yourself, and the pure light of consciousness that we remember from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Now, the mind, he argues, is not the brain, but the mind is filtered by the brain. This mind at large is always available, but the brain throttles it and forces us only to see mind at a small sort of slice of mind, if you will. So, in fact, we are two, once again. We are local and different, but we are also vast and irreducible. So mind at large is also, and the filter theory is human as two. You are your individual self that limits your experience of the greater reality, which is also the same as you. So mind at large and filter mind as well are not posited by belief or revelation. Material interpretations cannot grasp the psychedelic experience. You just can't call it a drug because it's more than a drug. You can't call Grant Morrison's sort of drug experience a drug when he had a little bit of hash and regularly smoked a lot of hash and suddenly had this powerful experience. The problem here is that the mind and the experience is so vast that simple solutions don't suffice. In this, the mind actually comes to, this mind at large comes to be outside the individual. Consciousness, which is identical to this mind at large consciousness, as we've been talking about all semester, is sui generis, which means it's a thing in and of itself. In fact, Kripal would argue that consciousness is the only thing that is actually real. The only thing that is independent on its own is consciousness moving. That's a bit much for me, but I'm intrigued. All right, so we also have another character named John Hick, who is a well-accomplished theologian, and he argued that religion, not necessarily mind, but, or in addition to mind, is a filter. So religions may be constructed, and absolutely are constructed by humans, but it also has a transcendental source. He's arguing that while humans may create religions and myths and stories and theologies, there's something more to it. There's something coming through. So in reality, we all have access to this transcendental source, or to God, or to the real in our imaginations. But what we see is that we are limited in our understanding of this transcendental divine because of the religions that we ascribe to and the religious lore that we have internalized. So if we can get rid of our religions, and he was a Protestant Christian theologian as well, if you could get rid of religious conditioning, you could understand reality as it is. He gives the metaphor of religion is sort of like a spiritualist medium, someone who contacts the dead and becomes possessed in a seance, not really possessed, but speaks and channels the dead in a seance. So he argues that God talks through religion like a spirit, which would be God, speaks and communicates through a medium. So again, this is another faithful rereading, or this is not another faithful rereading, because it posits something more that speaks through us that cannot be reducible to any one God or religious figure or religious dogma. Neuroscience, which I'm going to go over kind of fast because it's really intriguing stuff, but well, you know, we don't got all night. So in neuroscience, we find that, well, hold on, let me say this differently. So the human as two, and arguing for understanding the world in a non-material way, is not just found in the humanities and social sciences. In fact, most humanities and social science scholars are, in fact, full-on reductionists. They do that. Religion is merely X. Religion is merely Y. So this is made a little bit more complicated because a number of very well-respected doctors and neuroscientists have had experiences that parallel the mystical and the religious. They've experienced the high weirdness, and these are good, well-respected doctors. They've experienced the human as two. They've experienced the unlimited consciousness. Now, Kripal says about people who have had this experience that he says they've been split apart, and they've seen the human in both sides. They've seen the human as two. And he says they've been flipped. After a paranormal or mystical experience, one can no longer accept that consciousness is just material, that consciousness is just what's going on in your brain chemistry. In fact, you can no longer accept that human beings are limited and individual. However, such ideas are heresies in the hard sciences, even when people who are well respected say them. So I'm going to go over two examples here. So Jill Bolte Taylor had a stroke that shut down the left side of her brain. Now, the left side of the brain is responsible for rationality, for numbers, for differentiation, for systematization. And the right side of the brain is emotion, inspiration. The left brain is somewhat language specifics. Right brain is inspiration for what to speak. Left brain, rational, differentiated. Right brain, undifferentiated, wider, more open. Yes. So look at all these images here of right and left brains. It'll give you kind of an understanding of it. So it took a long time after her left hemisphere shut down. She was a neuroscientist, so she knew just what was happening while it was happening. It's a long time for the left hemisphere to come back online. Now, as the right side, or when the right side of her brain was very strong, she experienced an overall sense of oneness with people and with the universe. She could even see human beings as energy. So with her right brain fully operative and not being throttled by the left brain, again, mind as filter, brain as filter, she was able to experience what the mystics refer to. She was able to experience unifying light, expansive consciousness. In fact, she even describes that as her left brain was shutting down, she saw her limbs becoming long and crab-like as the right side of the brain took over. Kripal, being Kripal, is like, wait a minute, that sounds like alien descriptions. And in fact, there's some really cool stuff about alien abductions that talks about how the descriptions of aliens with big eyes, well, the eyes are processed by the right side of the brain. Long and sort of claw-like is also kind of like a right brain characteristic of perception. So maybe there's something to it. Maybe aliens are coming from the right side of our brain. Okay, so other scientists note that the brain seems to filter and shackle the fullness of the mind, And that can be witnessed. We can witness that throttling effect and witness it being released and stopping in trauma and in mystical experiences. The body shackles the mind at large. Now, Ian McGilchrist, who we watched the intro video for today, argues that the world and our world culture has been dominated by the left brain. And by emphasizing this left brain, we've become very material and rational. But he argues, in fact, that the left brain isn't the dominant one, isn't the master of the whole thing, as most people argue. The right brain is a problem, the left brain is a good thing. He says, in fact, the left brain kind of stinks. He argues that the right brain focuses on interconnectedness, implicit meaning, and with wholeness. It is actually the master of consciousness, and the left brain works using reason and abstraction to implement the will and the inspiration that comes from the right brain. I find this really interesting. So he establishes that, in fact, the left brain limits the potent powers of the right brain, where consciousness is more directly experienced. And he argues by being more right-brained in our thinking, we can be more successful, powerful, more clear in our understandings of the world. Okay, Jeffrey Kripal's game. What is he up to in all of this as we close down our last chapter? Kripal says over and over again that his book has an agenda, that his book is out to get you. And it has 3 parts. Those 3 parts are, and I'll just name the 3 sections. The first one is called prehistory, preparation, and perspective. That's where we just learned about different religions and different means for interpreting them. Then he has the second part, which is comparative acts. That's where he's comparing things really wildly in order to break apart ideas that you have about religion so you can see religion more widely and culture more widely. And finally, putting it all together again, when we go back and we do these rereadings based on our comparisons to kind of make sense of religion after we've kind of blown up all our ideas about religion. So in the first part, Kripal's goal is to give you tools to understand, categorize, and compare established religions. In the second part, he complicates everything by comparing widely. And in the last part, he brings everything back together to make sense of religion based on varied rereadings. His rereadings being faithful, rational, and reflexive. And you can bet that he was planning to end with reflexive rereading all along. That's where he wants to get. He wants us to be sort of stopping at that reflexive rereading and seeing that as the correct way to understand religion and to understand religion in our own lives. He compares this to a journey or an initiation ritual or even a religious quest. At the beginning of any journey, especially when we go a long ways abroad, or we travel for a long time, at the beginning, you're at home, you're comfortable, you understand your world and your culture. You believe that your culture and your religion is handed down from on high and through tradition, and your religion and your culture is the same as religion and culture is everywhere else. Everybody else thinks like us. Everybody else is a Protestant Christian. So you travel and suddenly everything's thrown off. The very experience of things being so different makes you realize that your home culture is constructed in the same way that these cultures you experience are. And then at the end, you come home and you take what you have learned to try to understand and interpret your own culture in fresh eyes with comparison to what you've seen. And you do see that your own culture was constructed all along. But you're different. You've been changed by going on this journey, as Kripal would argue, depending on how closely you read and how much it resonated with you. You are different after reading through his textbook. And you are different to other members of society. And this is kind of what I hope for you is from this class, you can be the most interesting person at the dinner party. I say this in a lot of my classes, but I think this one is particularly true. You will have interesting things to talk about, whether it's aliens or the history of yoga or Tantra, or, I mean, you are going to have cool stuff to tell people, or you can talk about Dean Radin and his sort of experiments with magic and their statistical whatnot. You got stuff, you got cool stuff. And you can also maybe go to church or go to a religious ritual of any sort, and you can kind of see it through your comparative eyes and be able to see how it works in a way that the average person has never really interrogated and gone into thinking about their own religion and other religions is not going to be able to do. But at the end, Kripal wants to convert you. And he wants to convert you to seeing this human as two, being the accurate description of the way humans and the way the world works and the way religion works. He wants you to understand all culture as a manifestation and refraction of consciousness. Consciousness, like I said before, is the only sui generis thing. It's the only thing that absolutely exists on its own, but that shines through everything. He wants you to see that all people have access to that second part of the humanist too. That we can see that there are man and gods, that we are both man and God. We are individual and we are the greater soul. We are consciousness and the unconsciousness. We are man and superman. We are normal and paranormal. So he wants us to shift to understanding religion and culture and the self in this wider manner so we can have a greater human potential or capacity that connects us to this greater side of the self. He believes that understanding the human as two will make humans better. This human as two is the root of the mystical and paranormal experience, and he wants to say it's the root of all experience. He also believes that this experience will lead to greater tolerance. I don't know if I buy a lot of this. I especially don't think the experience of the human as two leads to greater tolerance. I think you can have profound mystical experiences where you know the full consciousness of the world and still hate Muslims. That happens all the time. And someone would say, well, how can you hate them all as one? How can you hate yourself? And I've known mystics like this. I'm like, yeah, I don't care. They're not the same one. So you would say maybe they didn't have the full mystical experience. And I would say maybe the mystical experience isn't as potent always as you would say, and doesn't really affect all aspects of your brain, like your biases, your prejudices, who you hate. I mean, if you have a full experience of the love of God, you're not going to stop hating people that you've been hating on your whole life. So Kripal makes these sort of arguments like that. He says this, and I don't quite get what he's doing, but he says that he does not believe in any particular belief or belief system, but he does believe in belief in general. And this pulls back to his notion of consciousness. I would argue something different. I think that the supernatural is the root and pure repository for how we understand the world, but I don't think it's real. I don't think ghosts are there. I don't think aliens are there. I don't even know if God is there. Probably not. I mean, I'm a big fan of being a pessimist and positing that stuff isn't really there, but how we think about stuff, that's how we really understand things about us. That's how we understand our culture. And we can learn a lot about our culture by looking at ghosts and aliens. As to positing whether those things are actually there or not, I don't know. I don't really care, but I lean probably towards no. I find that I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I think that the ways people think about the supernatural are some of the most interesting things about people. Now, that said, crazy stuff happens to me, and I have had some pretty powerful experiences. I knew one occultist who would say that enlightenment is never eternal. It's always like turning on a light switch. Sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off. In that way, sometimes, yes, I do believe in aliens and ghosts and the mystical experience being more than just the fluttering of my brain. At other times, it's turned off, and I'm just like, this hogwash is really interesting. So that's my humanist too, is sometimes I believe in stuff and sometimes I don't. I'm trying to be honest. Yeah, so he also goes through, and Kripal makes these arguments over and over again about how, in fact, it feels like we were caught in a movie. And he says that this experience is common when people describe the paranormal. They say that I felt like I was caught in a movie or caught in a novel. And he talks often about this this movie with Will Ferrell in it called Stranger Than Fiction, which is an interesting movie, and I won't go into it right now. Watch it sometimes. So he has this idea that when we realize how a culture, a religion, or just the narrative of our lives is dictating directly or framing us, that is actually writing us, we can make changes. We can change how we think. We can be active. We can reshoot and rewrite ourselves and our experiences. This is the flip. This is when we realize that we too are writing the script that we are stuck in. So Kripal argues that human individual consciousness is the interaction of mind, body, and wider consciousness. Folk who study and describe consciousness do not know about the wild expansiveness of consciousness that is available to those who escape the filter, to the mystics, to those who have had paranormal experiences. So we go back and forth between the rational and the reflexive, and we want both, which makes sense because we are both rational and reflexive and faithful. We want to have all of these answers, and we don't want to settle on one because we are so multiple in and of ourselves. So Kripal stops there. I don't stop there. I stop at a different point. I would say that Kripal stops at consciousness and religion as consciousness and knowledge of the human as two that unlocks and interprets religion and religious experience. I don't stop there. I stop at somewhere he would not stop. I would say religion is about transaction with God and other supernatural and usually invisible beings who are explicitly not you. They are not you. They are not greater consciousness. They are something else. They are something else that you're interacting with. And you know, I have these conversations often with a priest friend of mine, how it's very important that to him that people aren't too mystical, that God is different from you, that God is not ever present, that God is a cosmic other that you interact with. There's an occultist I quite like named Dan Gunther, who argues at the end of a really great book he wrote called The Angel and the Abyss, and it's within Thelema, a specific type of occultism. And he says that the most important thing is to develop knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel. Everyone has a holy guardian angel. You can have the experience of the holy guardian angel when you listen, when you're quiet, and you're very, very quiet, and you can hear it talking to you. And he says, this is not your own voice. This is something other than you. Every human being may have their own holy guardian angel, and your goal is to create knowledge and conversation. But you can only get there by clearing yourself, by doing spiritual work and listening and realizing that it is not you. God is not you. The holy angel is not you. This is where I differ from a lot of mystics. Do I believe that those things actually exist? Probably not. So there's problems in the way I think about things. But yeah, God is other. God is different. Angels, aliens, this beautiful goddess here of that's so Indic. She's not you. Religion is about transacting with someone and something that is beyond you, or just that is not you, or even things that are lower than you that you have power. It's transaction with an other that can never really be known. So Kripal sees the study of religion as being something more than just making sense of religions. And he's perfectly right to do this, but I don't trust this move. What we do in religious studies is make religion intelligible. That's the goal. Interpret and make things intelligible. If you start making these sort of arguments about, you know, the goal of religion and religious studies and the history of religion, comparing religion is to understand consciousness, then it can really be easily used to reduce religious difference. Kripal argues that he insists on recognizing difference, that religions are different, that they're local, but he says that there's this consciousness beyond it. I just see that this is a really slippery slope back to sort of perennialism, that all religions are just the expression of one thing and are all essentially the same. This can easily be reduced to all religions are based on a specific entity or an idea or a specific argument, whether that argument is the human is two, or maybe the argument like Vatican II says that the spirit of Christ is anonymous in other religions than Christianity, but it's still the spirit of Christ, or all the deities are just avatars of Vishnu. I'm not comfortable with any of that. I think it's important to study religion and culture as different from you and different from your religion and culture and seeing religious difference. It is also important to study it without becoming a member of that religion or culture. You can try on the ideas of Judaism or Islam and kind of think about it, but to study religion, you don't need to convert, and I don't think you should. You can do an awful lot of studying and thinking and understanding without converting to a religion. To convert to a religion means you have to act out of a powerful and profound religious experience, or quite a few, or maybe you have a family history, or maybe somebody you really care about is a member of another religion, so you decide to join that community. All of these are valid. So it's also important to study religion without becoming a member of that religion or culture. I study India, but I am not an Indian. It is important that the gods remain separate. And it is important that the gods we talk about remain of their places and of their people. It's important that you connect the religions of India to Indians, or the religions of Tibet to Tibetans, and don't argue that these are universal religious truths or deities that are accessible to all of us. They might be accessible to all of us, but they derive from a specific place. So I say God is different than us. Entities that we interact with in religion are different from us. This consciousness thing is a good idea, and I would take it in a number of different directions, but I have my issues with Kripal. So what about you? Where do you end? Where do you end with this debate? We heard where Kripal ends with human as two, and then there's a double entendre there. Where do you end? Where does the you end? Does your you end in cosmic consciousness? Does your you end with God? Does your you end up with just right here? I think it's a bold and powerful assertion to just say, you know what? The world is real and it's different from me. I can believe that the world is consciousness and is the same and is just slowed down light and whatever until somebody socks me in the nose. Then my nose is broken and that fist is very real. I think there is a glory to the world being real and me not being in everything. But that's me. So I end with, where do you end? Kick it around.